Hey, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Low Code Approach. I'm Sean Fiene, a senior product marketing manager on the Power Platform and Microsoft Copilot Studio team, and I'm joined by...
I'm Wendy Haddad. I'm a senior customer experience program manager on the Planner team and a former Microsoft customer. And I am joined by...
So weird to hear Wendy saying that she's on the Planner team. It just
I'm
keeps
tripping over my intro every single time now.
every time. Anyway, yes, I am Ken Auguillard right here, the smooth velvet, as my Ryan Cunningham says, the baritone voice of the podcast here. And our next guest has a lot to say, but also nothing, if you will, right? Sean is looking at me with the puns. We have Priya. Sorry, I'm laughing. Priya Vaidyanathan. How are you today? What are you here for? What are you talking about?
Hi, Ken. Hi, Sean. Hi, Wendy. I'm so glad to be here. Well, I'm here to talk to you about zoned governance, a concept I know that's not unfamiliar to you, Ken, from your former life. Sean, I know I have probably talked your ear off on this when we first started working together, but definitely a concept that's very timely. Everyone's worried about the speed of which AI is appearing within their organizations. Agents are top of mind for every organization, for every business. And how do you look at agility, innovation, running fast, but also address all the concerns you have around risks with what are agents going to do? How are they accessing data? And do I want agent sprawl? I'm worried about everyone creating agents connected to various things. So a framework, a practical, applicable framework is what we've been talking about called zone governance. So that's what I'm here to talk to you guys today about, talk about top of mind concerns people are coming up with, and let's see how zone governance addresses some of that.
So before we actually get into the zone, hopefully no one sues us for that right there. Priya, would you say that the governance framework that you just described is an avenue for enablement within the product, and that this is something that can help our customers quickly, easily get on board and easily adopting agents with a level of comfort and so on?
Absolutely. I would say the zone governance framework serves two purposes. One, it tries to demystify and bring a ton of clarity to the powerful set of administration controls that are already available within the Power Platform. And there's a growing number of capabilities we continue to add every month. But what we're trying to land with zone governance is speed and safety are not compromised, and they're not at odds with each other. Zone governance allows for speed, but builds on the value of Power Platform, which is democratized grassroots innovation. People who are closest to the business know what to do, how to solve it for themselves versus for something in central IT. Yes, so absolutely, to your point, Ken, this is about accelerating innovation, but accelerating it within the guardrails that each company can define and implement through our admin center.
So Priya, this sounds like a mindset shift. And in a former life, I was a service manager and I worked with our security groups and our legal groups to be able to review applications to roll them out. And now, obviously, in the world of agents, everything is moving faster. So can you speak to that mindset shift? What maybe are you hearing from customers, how they have been thinking about approaching agents, and how with zones are we suggesting they change their thinking or use this framework to be able to move faster without compromise?
Yeah. So the funny thing, Wendy, is the zone governance framework is not new. It's not a new concept. In fact, for many of the customers we've already been talking to who are familiar and have been longtime Power Platform customers, they went through this mindset shift when it came to democratizing building apps and flows. And what they learned very quickly is you can't control innovation through a central team because you just don't get that acceleration or that time to value or even the creativity of how to solve a problem because you're so abstracted from what it is. So having practiced it before, what was interesting as even a mind shift for existing customers is AI and agents have come out and they're wrapping their head around what is the new level of risk. And sometimes they kind of forget they had implemented a really solid framework and it's practice through their COE. And now really we want to come back to and thread the needle with that framework that you had. It's not a one and done. You have to constantly evaluate and evolve how that zone governance can work for building agents. And then highlight, here's all the controls we've offered and how they fit back to those zones that you may have predefined. And it's a great opportunity to reevaluate if those zones were defined correctly, or if you want to course correct and adjust where the guardrails might lie. And maybe even if I were to poke in, the customers who had practiced zone governance, they already knew they needed to give makers an easy way to get started. And we allowed them to get started with the default environment. And as Ken knows, that was not probably the best way, but it accelerated innovation. We moved forward and allowed everyone to get started with personal developer environments. There was a quick recognition that sometimes these projects get past a POC and they need to move into a project that's shared, that's distributed amongst a team of people who will be using it. It probably needs some best practices and oversight. So we move that into a shared environment, that central organization that is a center of enablement or central IT who has practiced it can give guidance. And then there's a class that is like, oh, this is super important to my organization. This is a mission critical app. And the way you treat that, how you set up the environment, how you do disaster recovery, high availability, making sure you have the best practices of ALM there. All of this is possible, but it's intentional segmentation. And now we have to train people to think about it that way.
Yeah, so let's talk about the who, right, for our listeners, just to kind of ground them here. So, all of this, you talked about the different zones. Is all of this being reviewed by your central IT team, your central roles? Are we kind of decentralizing the governance now? Again, how do we ensure that we're just not trying to move faster and bury our poor admins here to review every single thing?
Well, that's a great question because historically, the center of enablement has been that central team that does oversight. And we've heard a variety of practices from our customers, but what's very, very common is the guidance, the practical applications of what the zones are, the definitions is done by a central team. Then once those zone definitions are done, so let's say you want to enable everyone to easily get started, build little experimental projects, you can set that up. And that can be a very self-service way to go do it. And you can really constrain what are the data sources, apps, flows, and agents can connect to. You're happy to let that be. Now you have a bunch of more interesting and departmental projects. You get to decide the policies from a central team and establish them. Once you establish those policies, you can then turn it over to the individual departments to manage the making and control the business outcomes and give some best practices. But you don't sort of decentralize governance at all. That is not the central stakes, but it is about thinking holistically across the organization, but putting in place a framework where you're not the bottleneck for every single decision that needs to happen.
That makes sense. Priya, you mentioned earlier that in the journey through the stages or the zones, if you will, there's this shared zone, right?
Yeah.
Is that a shared collaboration in using an agent or using a solution, or is that a shared area for building one? So like you and I are both building and collaborating on designing and deploying and implementing changes on an agent. Is there a difference between the two, or is it the same place?
That's such a great question. So if we were to step back and talk about the progression of the zones, because the zones are really set up for a potential progression, right? When you get started and if you're building something that's experimental, we think the zone is very much constrained to you individually making something for yourself or for a very, very small, limited group. Now, when we're talking about collaboration, which is the next sort of graduated zone up, we really think you are probably working with a few other makers, but what you're hoping to build, create as an agent or even an app with an agent is going to be distributed to more than a handful of people. You're thinking you're going to give it to a team, to a department. And as that size of who you think it's going to go to will get bigger, that collaboration zone itself is going to have some questions that's going to be asked of you. Should you be building and running your final solution from the same place? Probably not. That's not a good best practice, right? So yes, I think it's more to your point, Sean, what you talked about, which is that collaboration zone does not mean it's everyone can come build on one thing. We think there's a handful of people who are going to work together as a team of makers to build it. But we also believe that the thing that you're going to build and share and deploy is going to be for a bigger group than maybe 3 to 5 people.
Of course, now it's my turn, Priya, to put you in the hot seat here. So I'm listening to what you said, and thank you for, I guess, sort of outlining the beginnings of the zones and how someone can get started, and even sort of calling out, because we've had questions about, well, how do I do this? Do I say green, yellow, red? Do I do names? What is it? And we don't necessarily, I think, tell customers that you have to name the zones a particular way or anything like that.
That's right.
But they should look for things like trigger points, and I think you touched on some of them. But what are some of maybe the other things that customers can look at? Is it usage, sharing limits? Is it security? How do they go about distinguishing each zone?
Yeah. Yeah. So visually, I know we've talked about this in a few forums. We talk about when you're carving up your zones, looking at it on two axes, like you hit on, Ken. On one axis is risk. How risky is this thing that I'm connecting to, creating? And risk usually comes with what kind of data is it connecting to? What kind of actions would it be taking? Would it cost a lot? Like those are sort of managing
Yeah.
risk cost is one spectrum. And then the exposure, like how broadly is this going to be shared? And then so if you look at this on an XY axis, you kind of carve out your zones of the lower the risk, which is if I'm connecting to just my Office or M365 data and it's just limited to me, it feels fairly low risk, it feels contained.
Hmm.
Potentially, you can constrain the cost if you're all M365 Copilot licensed, right? Because there's no extra incremental charge. So that feels great for that innovation, personal innovation, experimental green zone. We've had so many labels for it. What I love, I'm going to throw a little shout out to Heineken, one of our customers. They've shared their zoning naming. It's super cute. They've named it after their beers. Heineken Light
Yeah.
is the experimental, starting zone. But that trigger point, where do you move from that innovation to now it's more of that collaboration or yellow zone? Like Heineken calls it Heineken Silver, right? There, it's about what are the data sources beyond M365 that you may want to connect to? Do you want to connect to some, line of business sensitive information? Are you going to be taking action? Are a lot of people going to be using and touching this? And if we think it's a lot of people, it's probably more cost. So you want stronger oversight. So I think that's kind of a trigger point, like that exposure. How broadly do you want to share it is potentially one of them. What kind of data do you want to connect to is probably one of them. And I think the next trigger point is even more, we call it the enterprise or mission critical. Like you need every employee to probably use this. Something like an HR assistant agent or like an IT help desk agent that literally everyone would be touching. You kind of want to make sure that never goes down. So you need a lot of strong oversight. So again, exposure is another trigger point, like company wide. Here, another one could be, even if it's not everyone, but let's say it's just an HR agent and it's accessing sensitive information like people's pay information. That's probably another trigger point to like further lock it down of who's building, who has access to it, and all of that. So I think those were two dimensions I'd look at. But I don't know,
Let
Ken, you've
me
also had practical applications here. Where else do you see this?
Well, let me jump in and ask this question for you because something you said sort of just struck me, and that is, using Heineken as the example, and everyone, hey, this is public, so we can find Heineken's story on the
Yeah.
website, so we'll put the show notes out those out in the show notes. Excuse me. The way you described what you just said, Priya, made me just sort of realize, and I think I knew this, but let me just state it for customers that zones, even though they may be whatever particular color or beer flavor that you may have, right? They can also be compound, excuse me,
Yeah.
compound, right? So I could have a green zone or a Heineken light zone, but even within that, I could have other little micro zones within that
Yeah.
all fit within that same risk profile and so on. So it's not that I'm creating one big container for all of these things. I can
Absolutely.
still chop these things up and add even additional granularity inside of those green zones, right? Is that fair?
That's totally fair. I love where you are going with this because I think it even speaks to some of the newer capabilities that have released that allow for that, right? Even within the green zone, if you allow everyone across your company by default to
Mm.
connect to M365 data sources, their own data, that's great. But let's say you want to allow the HR folks who work in the HR department to have access to a specific set of SharePoint sites that they operate against, that they want to build, and not everyone else in the company has access to it. That's great. That's an additional data source that you've allowed for a very specific department. You can group a set of environments, having access to that, limit who has access to those environments and how they build it and how broadly they can share it. And you've really constrained the risk within the parameters of what makes it like personal development or innovation or labs kind of thing. You're right. It's not put it all in the default environment and have one container to manage them all.
Hey, Priya, I'm going to jump on this topic of like micro zones, right?
Mm,
Because as we were talking about this, it kind of like spawned this idea of when you are establishing your zones, do you establish it at the enterprise and then solutions are placed into the zones for the entirety of the enterprise? Do you set up these zones by organizational units within the enterprise? Like HR has their own risk tolerances and, green, yellow, reds, or do they follow suit from the enterprise and then kind of break down at each organizational unit? So, like, how nuts can you get with the zones here?
What a great question. I think the answer really is it depends on your company. And Ken's going to laugh because I think we've had this very similar conversation with so many customers. And there are two things that we know to be true. That once you establish the policies for what your rough zones are, you're not done, right? And the zoning guidance tells you to think by risk and by scope. But then how you establish the microzones, is it by project or is it by department or is it some combination or hybrid? It really, you have to allow for the flexibility to learn as your company is adopting and evolving. Like once you've established this, you do need to have regular audits, like at some cadence, like I think quarterly, to go back and review the policies, review the environments, the environment groups, and how it's being utilized, and see, do you need to make some adjustments and do you need to revise your policies to keep that innovation continually flowing, but not be saddled with so much of burden and oversight and cleanup after the fact. And I think we give you a ton of capabilities within the platform to manage this at scale and do it proactively. But it is not a one and done set of rules. It is a learn, establish some guardrails, observe, learn, and continue to refine.
So maybe a two-part question. I'd like to understand, first of all, the why. And when I say why, the backstory, right? Because I think historically, Microsoft has not been as prescriptive around governance. And this feels a little more prescriptive to me. So how did this come about? I'd like to hear that. And then as well, I'd love to get a little more tactical in terms of the tooling that we may have evolved on over the last few years that make zone governance more accessible for our customers.
Yeah.
This is our Mr. T moment, right? This is me and Priya saying, I pity the customer who doesn't do what we say right here. Okay.
I think, Wendy, you're right to say that, hey, we weren't prescriptive with governance because at the start of the low code revolution, low code was inherently seen as low risk. But as customers started doing really complex, innovative, business critical things with low code, earning the credibility that this is not a toy to build like little toy apps meant that we needed to offer enterprises the right set of controls to be able to govern, control who has access to the most powerful capabilities. It's just not for non-coders. It's pro developers can come and build here. And that continuum and trend continued as we got into agents and the recent wave of generative AI. But coming back to it, we have introduced a ton of really powerful capabilities, starting first from environments, managing environments with connectors and additional security settings and policies. There's so much capability that came on. It's almost like here's a ton of raw ingredients. You figure out a recipe, what to go cook was starting to become the challenge for our customers. And we would be, it wouldn't be right to say Microsoft came up with a framework. This came up in collaboration with a lot of our great customers who found ways through centers of enablement to scale innovation. So zone governance is a concept that has existed in many different flavors, versions, even before low code. And when low code came in, we've had fantastic case studies, put out there in the public, and Forrester cited them, and, Gartner has even cited the zone governance framework. And what it's now teaching people is here's a recipe. Think about zones. And the recipe is here's a green zone or innovation zone. Here's the controls, how you might use it. We have constructs called environments. We have a default environment, personal developer environments. We have sharing limits. We have, advanced connector policies. We have all these great settings for Copilot Studio, which tells you, whether the agent should run as you, the maker, or in the end user's context, and so on and so forth. But these are all so many controls. What controls matter in which zone? And I think that's the framework, and that's a template or a recipe template we're putting out there to get people thinking about it, to understand how to slot these settings, and then evaluate, is that the right setting slider for their organization or for that business or for that particular project, and make tweaks. It's not so prescriptive that it's not flexible.
So on that, I literally just thought of this. Is zoned governance, this methodology, this framework, actually influencing our product roadmap? So is that helping us determine what we're building and how we're prioritizing features.
Absolutely. It's actually, I don't know, Ken, you should talk to me about this too, because we talk about this a lot when we are thinking about our roadmap and our backlog. We really look at when something is coming out there, how should customers, how risky is this? Where is it on the risk spectrum? What kind of controls would it need? And how would it potentially be applied in one of these zones? And it's a discussion that evolves with each of the product teams as we have that to enrich what we think we ultimately need to offer. And sometimes we also learn from customer feedback. We put something out there and then we learn from them where they perceive the risk, and we have a dialogue, and then we demystify where it's perceived risk but there isn't, and we get clarity where there is risk that we didn't completely understand. We come back and add the controls and work it back to our zones.
I think to add on to what you're saying, Priya, Zohar is very fond of saying, Zohar is my manager, Priya's peer, by the way, for everyone. Building product is hard. Building product is hard because we have to ask and think very critically. We have to listen to feedback and interpret customer signal and determine, is this noise? Is this something that we actually should be investing in? And we've heard you loud and clear over and over. You like for us to, lack of a better term here, tell you what to do when it comes to these things. And it's not necessarily that what we're saying is the end all be all truth, but we have a great database to pull from of customers and knowing what they all have in common to make them successful. So when you see Priya building something like this framework, it's from the lessons that we have taken away from not just one or two, but sometimes thousands of customers. We have research teams that are heavily involved in this, and they help us build these types of frameworks for you. So rest assured that it's not just us pulling a rabbit out of our hat, Bullwinkle. It is actually backed by data, research, and real life use cases.
Absolutely.
Anything more to add, Priya?
No, I feel like you hit it on the head, because it is, like we said, there's a history. It's not a framework we invented, but it is grounded in practical customer applications who have implemented zone governance, who had implemented it once, forgot about it, let it go, and we're like, oh, got to come back and keep on top of it. The part that you touched on, which is knowing what building product, is hard. When it comes to administrative controls, being thoughtful in the dialogue with our customers and thinking like, I need a setting. If we were to implement every setting that we ever heard, feedback on, what we will find is it's so easy to toggle all of these different knobs and get yourself into such a broken state that nothing works. So it's being really thoughtful about understanding the nature and the need of what this control is trying to solve, where customers are perceiving there is risk, and then discussing the set of controls that will constrain that risk and apply them in the right zones. Again, allow for a risk exposure in a controlled way without breaking yourself into a jail of broken state that you can't get out of.
So we talked a little bit about customers. And actually, first off, before I get to this question, shout out to Ken for the Bullwinkle reference. Bring in the young audience. I appreciate that. The second thing is we mentioned customers and learning a lot from customers and getting customer questions and that kind of helping us shape the product. We're going to see a whole bunch of customers at the Power Platform Community Conference. Priya, what can they expect in regards to zone governance, questions about zone governance, interactions, hands-on things to implement zone governance? What can we see there?
Yeah. Fantastic tee up. Number one, Ken and crew will be running an amazing workshop where you'll get to do a lot of hands-on application of first even understanding the framework, practically applying it. How would you set it up with environment groups and rules? The second thing, there will be a ton of great sessions where we will talk about governance, both from the community and from the Microsoft perspective. And I think Zohar and I will be there. We'll talk about agents, governance, security, and anchor it to the framework and talk about the practical things. The real practical reality, the questions that come up even from the last set of conferences that Ken and I were a part of, really came down to, okay, I hear you on the zones. I hear you with enable agents. How should I think? What is the implications to licensing if I do this? Okay, and they all go hand in hand, right? And it is a delicate balance, and the answers is always depends. But I think the combination of workshops and the sessions and the dialogue with other customers who have implemented it enrich that understanding of what it means to go after and do it. So I hope people who come to the conference will not only take away a better understanding of what zone governance is, how to think about the zones, but then see from other conversations how customers have implemented it, take a bit of learning from that, come to the workshop, try their hands on with some of the actual controls, get deeper familiarity with it, and get a chance to connect with all of us, hopefully in person, and, pick our brains on additional ways, and, things we've not thought about yet. So we can continue to evolve our approach.
So let me add a little point, a little teaser here. Every year when we do these workshops, they just keep getting better and better. And I think it's largely in part because of the feedback that we receive, but also because of the audience that we have in the customers. You know, this year, I can't say, obviously, what we're planning, but last year I can say that we gave everyone in the workshop, for the past 2 years, firsthand look before we even announced things at the conference. And we gave them hands-on experience. This year, we have something very interesting that we are going to be releasing that customers have been asking for years. So if you want to play with it,
You want to come to Ken's workshop?
you want to come to the workshop. So
I will
Way to
say,
Wendy,
leave
Ken,
everyone on a cliffhanger.
Yeah,
I know
managed
Ken's
environment
sessions are
spinners,
great.
cool.
Ken is always the last session we did, people are hanging on to every word because it's a little bit of a product teaser, a little bit of, yes, I'm finally getting that control to, oh, that's really interesting. Because Ken, you've lived that experience, right? You've
I
lived
have.
it, you felt the pain, you've helped the platform administration controls grow. And so there is some real truth to a lot of things that were developed because we didn't invent them. They're coming from people like yourselves who've lived the pain and helped us grow.
Yeah, but it's not just me. I mean, Sean has lived it as well. Wendy
Yeah.
has gone through
Yes.
the ringer of it um,
Yeah.
a lot, and she still has decided to join the product team. So, Wendy, anything more to add?
We love that.
I think it's really interesting, and you teased Heineken a little bit, and maybe we could talk a little bit more about that story, or if you have other customer examples, because yes, in fact, as I think back to my previous life, there was the whole mindset. Now, this was back in the app days, even before agents, but this whole framework of, do we have a centralized, we review everything, which honestly burns your people out and stalls your organization's innovation. And I have seen firsthand, front row, where when we decentralized and centralized on the critical things, we generated revenue, and we saved so much time and pain. So I'd love to hear more of those customer examples, whether you can name them, or if you want to just kind of summarize what you're seeing, like what has been the impact of this framework? And then maybe as we're kind of landing the plane here with this episode, how should our listeners get started
Yeah.
with the zone governance?
Yeah. So I will say Heineken is the public story where we've shared their named zoning, but there are so many more other organizations where we've seen a very, very similar process start up. Whether they formalized it with names or not, they now intrinsically understand they had carved out some zones, and now they're being more thoughtful about the policies. And the part that Ken mentioned earlier, which is, what is that transition point? They're being more intentional. They knew they needed to do self-service, like you said, to get out of being that central choke point and having to have oversight and overview over everything, and just only focusing on where it matters. Knowing the trigger points of where you go from self-service into, oh, this is a project that needs a little bit more oversight. So implementing the guardrail, so there's a forced bump versus retroactively catching people. That's what we've learned from a lot of customers. The thing that we have also found from learning to our customers now in the age of AI and AI agents, Ken and I and team were just chatting about this yesterday. There's an emergent new role called the Chief AI Officer, right? We've seen this role being hired for in a number of companies. And the Chief AI Officer doesn't do things like spot innovation or lead central innovation teams. Their job objectively is to look across companies and see how to holistically allow for AI-driven innovation. And surprise, surprise, the CAIO has a lot of similarity to what COEs were doing. They are running AI centers of enablement. And this is an industry-wide trend. We're also seeing it reflected with a lot of our customers. And when you have an AI center of enablement, those are the organizations that have seen accelerated adoption of agents at the grassroots innovation. They're finding that they're able to identify what bets are winning sooner and they're being more intentional about measuring what's being used. They're being intentional about allowing business unit owners to define what value means. In fact, recently inside of Copilot Studio, if you built an agent, an autonomous agent, you'll see an experience to allow you to calculate the time and cost savings and have that reflected back for your business leaders to be able to capture value. So the takeaway is, you're right, Wendy, your lived experience was absolutely right. Being that central choke point did not give you the benefits of seeing innovation and transformation at that same rate. We are reestablishing those again in the age of AI. And when I say AI centers of enablement, they're very, very focused on looking at how AI agents, Copilot adoption, being thought through organizationally, holistically is important and kind of critical for that juncture. Everything else is practical details of how you implement, how you set up your environment
Yeah.
groups, what rules you apply for them. Those are just practical realities that sort of fall out of when you kind of sit with the AI is important to me.
Very cool. Priya, this is a huge topic, and we're getting the virtual hook from our producer. So we've got to wrap it up. But we've got PPCC, or Power Platform Community Conference, come up. There's tons of content there, so much to talk about, and so many interactions that'll happen there. And then a whole bunch of news will come out. Ken alluded to a ton of it. So if you haven't signed up, sign up. Definitely sign up for the workshop. It's going to be incredible. Chat with Ken, chat with Priya. It's going to be an awesome time. We got to have you back on soon, because as new technology comes out, new guardrails are in place, new things are going to introduce new portions to zone governance and the qualifiers and how you associate risk to it. So I can't wait to have you back on, and we will talk all about zone governance and all the changes in the future. Thank you so much, Priya.
Love it. I'm happy to deep dive on our first zone, because that's the hardest with Copilot and agents and Agent Builder. I'm looking at Ken. These are all the things that Ken is grappling with on a day-to-day basis.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Priya.